All right, let's head over to the cloud here. Sunday night, special spectacular. Mr. Joe Sinnott on the Zoom line with us out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. How you doing today, sir?
I'm doing fine, Jason. How about yourself?
Well, not too bad. I appreciate you joining us on a Sunday. We're trying to get all timeliness and the WWE styled NFL draft, which translates so nicely to just a regular workplace when you're talking about controlling your narrative and expectations might not be what they are, and whose expectations are they? And this whole Shedeur Sanders in the NFL draft thing has got so many parallels to modern life. I thought we'd take a little bit of a time and talk with Joe Sinnott, who's an executive coach. He's been with some mergers and acquisitions, and he's also coached some CEOs and some career changes and all kinds of different gamut, that sort of thing. So, how you doing? Did you watch the draft? Did you check out any of the draft? You're a Steelers fan, so
Well, I'm in Steelers territory for sure, so it'd be tough whether I wanted to follow it or not. You don't have much of a choice in the weeks leading up to the draft, and then heck, even looking ahead to the future because Pittsburgh will be hosting the draft next year. So, yeah, we're smack dab in the middle of the discussions this year. So tough again, tough not to follow. I didn't plan my life around all 3 days here of devoting myself to the draft. But again, tough to miss in this part of the world, Jason.
especially with our phones and tablets and Wi-Fi and the apps and the whole deal along those lines. And you've got five different networks streaming live analyses, if you will. They're all watching one channel, and then they go to their own little live stream and they do their own little analysis or whatever. But I forgot, you're a New York Giants fan. You're a New York Giants fan in Pittsburgh Steelers country. I'm a Washington Redskins, Washington football team, Washington Commanders fan in Minnesota Vikings territory. So that's it. You're a Giants fan, right? If my memory serves me
I
correctly.
certainly grew up a
Yeah.
Giants fan. Now, once you get married to somebody from Western PA, have a couple kids in Western PA, obviously, Steelers become, part of your family identity, though, Jason, for sure.
And that's interesting. We should even start like that. Bringing on your, taking on your company culture into your home life and your workplace. And I had to become a Minnesota Vikings fan by osmosis just because of where I live and geography along those lines. But let's talk a little bit about the draft because it's interesting when some of the headlines say that Shedeur Sanders slid or he fell when a lot of those reporters had never even talked to one NFL coach. They just did a mock draft themselves. And so, because he didn't go where they thought he should go without talking to anybody, without doing any due diligence. And the reason I bring this up in a workplace, because it's a lot like social media. So often in today's workplace, we can develop a narrative based on social media. So, Joe, talk me through a little bit about expectations based on reality and expectations based on a false narrative, whether it's created by a sports writer or social media or that manager that has an axe to grind, whatever it might be. We've all faced a false narrative and we've all faced reality in the workplace, Joe.
Yeah, and I think, well, regardless of what the falsity is, Jason, from a coaching standpoint, what's funny is so much of my time is spent with people saying, me saying, well, says who? It seems like such a simple question, Jason, but to your point, who says that Sanders slid, 100 slots? Who says that he, was being looked at by X teams? Who, and obviously, again, we can start answering those questions, but sometimes again as these narratives take root, they take hold, they are seen as the truth when a simple question like that, which is, okay, well, says who? And that just doesn't apply when it comes to narratives, Jason. It applies to rules that people are following, right? In business and in their personal lives. Hey, oh, I should do this. Oh, I got to do this. Well, says who? So, I mean, we can start there, Jason, because again, not rocket science, what I do on a day-to-day basis. And it's amazing how often it comes back to challenging, again, whether it's challenging a narrative or challenging a rule or a perception or a quote unquote truth. yeah, where is this coming from? And that simple act, that simple question can, stop a lot of people, again, from CEO down to frontline worker, stop them in their tracks and say, huh, yeah, that's a good question.
So let's say you're going through a little bit of a change, whether it's internally or it's a new company. In the case that we're kind of talking as our talking point, if you will, is Shedeur Sanders from the Colorado Buffalo into the NFL, now is drafted by the Cleveland Browns. But before then, right around Christmas time, no, right around the Super Bowl, that's when it was. Uh, Shedeur Sanders' father and Shedeur Sanders' coach, who happens to be the same person, Deion Sanders, who happens to be a Hall of Fame NFL player, so he has proper pedigree. But his father was going around to some different talk shows talking about how his kid was going to be this top NFL draft and even saying there's some teams he might not want his kid to play for. So Shedeur had someone speaking on his behalf. Now, it was his coach, or in the case of an executive, a manager. And that happens a lot. That happens a lot, whether it's at a conference or whether it's at Super Bowl Radio Row weekend, Joe. Somebody is telling your story. And so, whether it could be your dad, I mean, I know my parents told my story for years at church. Whether I turned out to be that or not, it's a different story. But how do you manage that when it's your manager, your coach, your parents, whatever it might be? Sometimes I used to tell people all the time, be very protective of your reputation because once that wildfire starts, it is really difficult to put out.
Yeah, and I think it's take that a step further, Jason. I think it's tough to put out on your own. So in those circumstances and those relationships, the longer it goes on, obviously the tougher it is to put out the fire, if you will, or to slow things down. And so again, not to come back to my role too much, but having an independent person to come in and say, hey, Shedeur, what would you want to say if you could say anything to anybody? What would you want to say? Nice open question because I guarantee you, there's no, 20 something year old kid that's going to say, oh, I want to say the exact same thing that my dad is out there touting, right? It's, hey, well, I'd love for people to know X, Y, and Z. But without anybody else coming in, again, with that independent questioning, that independent voice to say, well, again, what do you want people to know about you? What do you want people to know your long-term aspirations are? It's amazing where a simple question like that is likely going to have at least some deviation from, again, the narrative that Dion is out there doing. So, again, not to always push people towards, hey, have a third party, have an independent voice, have somebody else to challenge you. But Jason, when you have relationships, and again, this goes well beyond sports, right? When you've got these sort of unconscious strong relationships that really go unquestioned, well, the longer they go unquestioned, the tougher it is to, again, as you said, put out the fire. So I guess, in terms of advice then for people in that situation, it is, hey, who else could you enlist? Again, all in a positive way. Who else could you enlist to sharpen that narrative, to ask a couple extra questions, to make sure that you're not just unconsciously going through the motions, even if outwardly those motions seem fine, as they may have in the case of, Deion Sanders advocating and certainly representing his son.
Joe Sinnott is our guest executive coach for Whitting Partners. He's also the host of the Energy Detox podcast. We're doing some parallels with the Shedeur Sanders NFL draft, NFL Cleveland Cavaliers opportunity with just executives, with just career coaching, with a number of different things because it is very universal. And whether it's somebody else telling your story, trying to control your narrative, trying to get a handle on the reality of what it is, now it's reality time. In the case of Shedeur Sanders, he's drafted. And the reality is that the company that picked him actually traded up to get him. So the company did demonstrate that they did want him. It just wasn't in the expectations that other people had. That's the part that I found very interesting because Cleveland had their own analysis of this employee and they said he's right here. And so when that time came and they realized they had an opportunity to jump up by giving a little bit of resources for the future because it's going to pay off now. That's really common, Joe. That's a signing bonus in the executive levels. That's a pay raise in the executive levels. There's some stock bonuses involved here. In some cases, back in the old days in radio, you might get a pool in your backyard instead of a raise. There's all kinds of ways that you can, really take advantage of opportunity here. And so, talk to me a little bit on one hand about the company actually showed that they were interested in him, although his peers didn't. His peers actually set him up for failure. Well, the company, the Cleveland Browns, showed examples. Does that make sense? Am I making any sense here?
Well, it makes sense. And actually, I mean, it's interesting under the umbrella of controlling a narrative, right? Because sure, they traded up, but again, we're talking about trading up in the fifth round. It's not, it's not like they made some blockbuster move 2 days earlier. The other thing, Jason, yeah, companies, they might make those moves and they might pat themselves on the back or use that as as a opportunity to say, hey, look at us. We're not afraid to make moves when it makes sense, right? We're put our money where our mouth is. We're making these decisions now in the short term, but with the hopes of long-term benefits, all that type of stuff. But then take a step back. What did they already do in the weeks and months leading up to the draft? Well, they brought on board Kenny Pickett. Again, all roads lead to Pittsburgh. So Kenny Pickett, former University of Pittsburgh player, former Steeler, former Eagle, and he was excited to come in and really, feel like he has a chance to be the starter. They got Joe Flacco. They drafted, obviously earlier in the draft, the Browns also drafted a quarterback, right? So they already made all these moves, and now it's like, hey, here's this latest distracting move that they made. Well, what was the decision process? And again, in the weeks and months leading up to that moment in time. So again, I don't have an answer for that necessarily, but that's the type of thing that if you're the Browns, you got to answer for. And when it comes to, again, under the umbrella of controlling the narrative, what have they done to control that narrative? What have they done to, not have all the people chuckling in Pittsburgh saying, "Oh, well, Kenny Pickett's probably not not quite as excited as he was about his journey to Cleveland." So anyway, I mean, that's probably less insight into anything on, from a usable standpoint, probably more insight into how I view this, Jason. But that goes on all the time within companies, right? You're making all these moves. There's all this focus on the flash and this new person. Well, how did you address everything that was done with your, existing resources up until that point? And, a lot of times it doesn't take a lot of energy to proactively address that narrative, to, make everybody else at ease instead of putting your foot in your mouth if you're, leadership. And now nobody's happy. Sanders is not happy because he went so late, right? Why'd you pass over me all these other times? And then the existing folks that were, feeling pretty good up until Saturday morning are also saying, well, what's going on here?
It's interesting because we could do an entire show just on Kenny Pickett. I mean, what he represents in this whole process because um, to me, and sorry, folks, I'm going to get a little sportsy on you for a second, but follow my analogies here in the world of business because much like the Atlanta Falcons last year when they signed Kirk Cousins for an extraordinary amount of money, several weeks later drafted a young quarterback, it showed that they were kind of changing the oil while driving 90 miles an hour down the interstate. That's what the Cleveland Browns were doing when they got Kenny Pickett. It's like, okay, we need to hang on to our franchise player. I promise you we will sign you a a NFL Super Bowl champion quarterback. Okay, Kenny Pickett, check one. Joe Flacco, check two. We didn't say they were going to be awesome. They're going to be Super Bowl champions, but they didn't get them. They got Myles Garrett, two of them. So you got to give up that. But Kenny Pickett also is like a token right now because he probably will not be on their starting day roster. He will probably be the one that's cut, and he was the one they first brought in. And so he's kind of like a little bit of a used and abused a little bit too, but he's the hometown boy. I'm sorry, but Kenny Pickett, we can go a lot of different directions in a lot of different ways. I don't know if you got anything to say on that, but
No, and again, I don't even know if I answered your original question from before, but again, it's looking at it through the lens of a Pittsburgher. It's tough not to look at it through the lens of Kenny Pickett and say, hey, how many Kenny Pickett's do you have in your organization? People that have moved around, they have some value, but they also have a lot of baggage. And, now you're bringing in somebody like Sanders who also has maybe not baggage, but certainly, no shortage of, intangible things, off the field things that, by all accounts, probably didn't help his stock, if you will, in the first 4 rounds of the draft.
But let's take a look at, instead of baggage, let's take a look at what in businesses try to do is move forward. Okay, move forward. And there are certain individuals that just are great role players, but they're not necessarily going to push you forward. And like role players are needed, forward pushers are needed. You also need, all different kinds of colors on the rainbow, if you will. And so when I take a look at somebody like Shedeur Sanders and Kenny Pickett for this example, Kenny Pickett was a bridge to a certain point and apparently is much shorter than we thought. But Shedeur Sanders is faced with, do I go backwards or do I go forward with opportunity? Because there's conversations that he could probably go back to school. I know his 4 years of eligibility are up, but everybody's suing the NCAA right now, and they're talking about how they could easily fold in a lot of different things. So, just for a thought exercise here, let's say it happens to where he goes back to school because he would make more money, Joe. He would make more money under the NIL than he would for his contract. However, there's more opportunity in the NFL with some different sponsorships, with some different contracts that can come in the future. So, short term gain equals long term pain. This is one of those examples where whether it's Shedeur Sanders or Kenny Pickett, you got to look at it like, what is my short term gain here and what is my long term goal? Because, yeah, I could go back to college if I'm Shedeur Sanders and probably make another $6 million in NIL money. Or I can go make my $500,000 as a fifth round pick as the son of Deion Sanders because I know I'm going to parlay that into greater greater futures. Anyway, that's just kind of a long way to say 2 steps backwards, 4 steps forward, or that sort of thing. Just your thoughts on that.
Well, I think what you're describing is the thought process or the mindset of, every great innovator, right? Hey, let's see what's in front of me. Let's see what's already been done. How do we build something that's even greater than what was in place before? And, even if you're handed a relatively crappy situation, again, by some accounts, hey, how do I emerge stronger or wealthier or, have more likely to have a Hall of Fame career than I would otherwise? And, already there was a lot of chatter even before, I think even before the draft started, it was, hey, Sanders might actually be better off even monetarily by not going in the first or second round because, or was it the first round? I think, there's that 5th year option that teams have. So, he might be free and clear, by year 5 and can make a heck of a lot more money than he would if he was still under control. So there's all those little, some of those things get a little specific, but the mindset in general is, hey, how do I leverage this? How do I take advantage of this in a way that I emerge stronger so that you resist that temptation to just go back to what's comfortable, go back to college, if you will. I think, there's a lot of folks who, who at various points in their life say, oh boy, what would it like to just be, nice to go back to the relative comfort of, a college situation. But again, the innovators, the successful folks, the sustainable leaders, if you will, they're the ones who say, whatever crappy situation, whatever crappy commodity price you're going to give me, how do I actually wind up stronger? And I think Jason, that's a mindset that, obviously would do Sanders well, or Sanders and Sanders if we continue looking at the duo there as a team. And, any leader in any industry would do well to say, again, the anybody that works with me knows that one of my favorite tools, again, not an original tool of mine, is, hey, what I like about that. Hey, what I like about being drafted in the 5th round instead of the first round is, much, got a much bigger chip on my shoulder that I can use. Maybe less pressure than I would have had otherwise. All, any litany of things, some of which might sound like rationalizing, but it only takes 1 or 2 of them to be like, hey, this is a gift. This is something I wouldn't have had otherwise. But now I'm focused. I'm more conscious. I'm not going to unwittingly just kind of step into, my NFL career and go through the motions. That's an advantage. If again, you got that right mindset, which again, Jason, I think you described quite well.
Do you coach people on social media in the professional world? I'm thinking about when Shedeur Sanders was drafted, and he was very excited and thankful for his opportunity and jumped in the pool. And and to me, that's classy. You do it with grace. You don't get upset because you're grateful for the opportunity. I'm sure his father schooled him and coached him immensely on that. But we live in a world of social media where anybody can do these kind of Instagram or LinkedIn or Facebook press releases, press conferences, if you will, and shout outs and that sort of thing. Does that ever come up in do you coach on social media at all?
Not a lot. A lot of it's in the context of, hey, if you have a platform and a message, and again, it's something that can reinforce what you're delivering internally to your teams, and you can share something externally to, again, put a little bit more meat behind it. That's typically the, where it comes up, Jason. But, even beyond social media, it's no different. A lot of companies have internal platforms that they can post on, that they can share in. And so, there's a lot of conversation there to say, hey, how do you take advantage of this? What tone do you want to set? And it's, it doesn't even have to be on any sort of internal messaging system. It could be just, hey, heading into a meeting. It's no different, right, Jason? It's what do you want people to see? What do you want people to repeat to others? That's a big piece, right? Think about social media, how many reposts or retweets or whatever. It's no different inside a company. What do you want other people to basically share with others? What do you want that second, third, fourth degree remark about you as an individual to be? No different from the approach on social media. It's actually playing out those iterations, playing devil's advocate at times to say, hey, how could that be misinterpreted? And then going forth and honing in on a message that is going to, again, statistically land land you in a much better spot.
All right, as we wrap up, let's ask you a question why they pay you the big bucks here, because this next one I believe is going to be extremely relevant to anybody out there. And I'll give you an example with myself because, no better person to pull examples from than yourself because I can speak for myself as opposed to speak for others. So in the world of media, the deadline and news cycle has gotten very short. It used to be weekly and monthly in some cases for magazines, even daily newspapers. You could take a story and write it for a week, give, different days, different angles. And now, you're lucky. Like the Trump assassination, what did that get? 3 days, 2 days? And it was already out of the news cycle. So there you go. A U.S. president assassination attempt, and it got a couple days in the news cycle. So, my question to you, Joe, is patience versus reinventing yourself. Because in the day of the turnaround deadline, in the day and age of social media, some people are putting themselves out there on social media 4, 5, 17 times a day. And so in their mind, to even take a step back for 3 days, my goodness, they might have to have therapy sessions. They might feel like they're missing out on a lot. So talk to me a little bit about, I don't want you to be a psychologist by any means, but there is some professional coaching involved here about patience and reinventing yourself, because honestly, that's to me what Shedeur Sanders was going through more than anything. Should I have some patience on this, or should I wait and reinvent myself when I have my opportunity?
Yeah, the biggest thing, and again, I do see it quite often in the career transition folks, Jason, but quite a bit too in folks that are more we could say again comfortable or safe in their roles. And the problem is, Jason, a lot of times, yeah, what other people might see as reinvention really is not reinvention. It's small tweaks. There's just different means to the same end. The problem is, Jason, a lot of people can't articulate what that end is. So if Shedeur Sanders from day one said, hey, my end goal is to be one of the top 10 quarterbacks of all time in the NFL, then as all these little things come along, whether he needs to be patient or not, or whether he's drafted in the first round or the fifth round, or whether he, puts his foot in his mouth at some point and does something inappropriate, or on the flip side, he's getting a bunch of credit for, I don't know, saving a flock of birds or, helping some old lady cross the street, whatever it is, he can stop and say, hey, look, all of these little things, all of these little distractions, at the end of the day, believe it or not, they're all connected to help make me the best, whatever I just said, top 10 quarterback of all time in the NFL. So that it's not even viewed as a rebrand. It's not viewed as reinvention. All of these things are just different paths to the same end. It's when you let other people say, "Oh, here you go. Here we go again. This person's just trying to come out with a new brand," right? I think I feel like that phrase maybe has been slipping over the last year or two, but right, it was all about building your personal brand for years. Say, no, my brand remains the same. This is my end goal. This is who I want to be. There's just, again, maybe a little different flavor here and there, but the more you can confidently kind of tap that end goal sign, Jason, it becomes way easier. And so I do spend a lot of time with people getting clear about that, whether you call it their pillars, their values, their mission statement, but getting something that is so sound and solid that even when you think it's changing, you step back and say, look, that's still you. But you got to control the narrative by reminding other people to say, hey, again, I might be going down a different path. I might have a different jersey color, right? I might have we obviously have some players over the years who might even change their name or whatever, but to remind them to say, look, at the end of the day, as a reminder, here's my end goal. And it hasn't changed. That's the holy grail, Jason. That helps keep people focused and it helps keep people around you engaged as well. And it makes their job easier to identify when you really are straying from a path that leads you to your end goal.
I mean, it's almost like they've set up the Shedeur Sander story as he's now in the mailroom. Like he just got hired in the mailroom. And is he going to work his way up to be the CEO quarterback of the Cleveland Browns? That's to me the way that, I mean, when I take a look at the last few days and the way they made it seem and all these other things, it was absolutely a remarkable several days for the NFL draft. And kudos to the NFL for turning something that is an extremely boring event into something that was must watch or must pay attention to. And I honestly, I mean, American Idol, that was probably the highest rated NFL draft since Robert Goodell watched American Idol. That was the live stream of that, I've talked to people who've gone to drafts and they tell you it was the most boring experience ever because literally you just sit around for 15 minutes and wait for someone to go up to a podium, speak, and that's it. Then it's just sit around and wait. But on TV, it's great. It's analysis, it's dreams, it's hope, it's all this other stuff. But anyway, well, thanks for the time tonight on this Sunday night. And any final thoughts that people should be walking away from in the life lesson that the NFL has taught us over the last 3-4 days?
Well, well, Jason, I guess I'd be remiss not to take an opportunity here as a Pittsburgher, to say that the draft is coming here next year. And even though I was in the camp over the last couple of months of people who say, what is the fascination with the draft? I mean, I've never cared, but then like you, again, you get sucked into all of this. So I guess that being said, Jason, for anybody that's out there doubting that the draft isn't the thing to watch and the place to be, remember that, you could be here in Pittsburgh in April of 2026 enjoying whatever storyline is thrust upon us by the powers that be. So maybe that doesn't help folks when it comes to leadership and consciousness and everything else. But hey, all roads lead to Pittsburgh, especially next year. So why not place a plug for our fair city in the mix here at the end of this conversation?
And my goodness, I think Arch Manning is going to be one of the quarterbacks up for the draft next year. And so it's going to be a Manning fest in Pittsburgh. Oh, my goodness. All right. Well, Joe Sinnott, Whitting Partners, the Energy Detox Podcast. Check it out, folks.